As we look at the moon, many people have wondered, how did the moon get here? Where did it come from? Well, the Bible tells us clearly where it came from. It was created on day 4 of creation week. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And the evening and the morning were the 4th day. The moon was made to mark out times and seasons and to rule the night. Indeed, it is the dominant light in the nighttime sky. But evolutionists don't want to accept creation, so they look for other answers. In fact, evolutionists were very excited about the Apollo moon program back in the 1960s for just this reason. They thought that the lunar missions would help them understand how the moon could have formed all by itself, without a creator being involved. This is Apollo 17 astronaut Harrison Schmitt. He was not only the last astronaut to walk on the moon, he was also a PhD geologist as well. Schmitt and the other astronauts gathered samples from the moon's surface and brought back hundreds of pounds of moon rocks with them. These rocks revealed some very interesting things about the moon. At the time, there were 3 main evolutionary theories for the origin of the moon. Evolutionary scientists were eager to analyze the moon rocks and see which of their theories was right. The 3 theories were the fission theory, the nebula theory, and the capture theory. Let's talk about each one. The fission theory said that the early Earth was spinning very rapidly. Then a chunk of material tore off and became the moon. This theory had problems though. Tests showed that lunar rocks are different than Earth rocks in some important ways. For example, the moon is deficient in iron when compared to the Earth. Also, if this idea was true, the Earth would have been spinning incredibly quickly. It would have been rotating just once every 2.5 hours or so. Problem: how did it slow down to today's speed of once every 24 hours? All that excess spin energy would have had to have gone somewhere. Calculations showed that this amount of energy would have been enough to raise the temperature of the entire Earth by 1,000 degrees Celsius. This would have boiled away all the Earth's oceans. Therefore, since we still have oceans today, we know this theory is wrong. The nebula theory said that the Earth and Moon formed out of a swirling cloud of gas and dust. This is just like the overall evolutionary theory for our solar system, with the gas turning into planets, but just on a smaller scale. The problem here is that this meant the Earth and Moon were formed from the same stuff, and the Apollo missions showed that moon rocks are different than Earth rocks. There are also real problems in getting the Earth and Moon to form from a cloud like that. The third theory was the capture theory. This says that the Moon formed elsewhere in our solar system and was traveling along one day when it passed too close to the Earth. The Earth's gravity pulled it in, or it took up housekeeping and started orbiting our planet where it is today. There are several problems with this idea. The biggest one is that one object can't capture another one gravitationally like this, not without interacting with other objects too. If it were just the Moon approaching the Earth, then the Earth's gravity would have accelerated the Moon on the way in. By the time the Moon arrived, it would be going too fast to stay in orbit. So there would only be 2 options. Either the Moon would hit the Earth, or else it would zoom on by and get flung away on the other side. Either way, you don't get an orbit. So, the Apollo missions left evolutionists in a turmoil. It's interesting to read their debates from the time. None of the evolutionists could really argue, well, my theory is right, because each theory had fatal flaws. Instead, they all said, well, it can't be any of those theories because they're obviously wrong. So in a sense, they were all right, because they were indeed all wrong. A few years after the Apollo missions ended, a NASA publication said this: "In spite of everything that we have learned during the last few years, we still cannot decide between these 3 theories. We still need more data and perhaps some new theories before the origin of the Moon is settled to everyone's satisfaction." What does it mean when you have several theories already, but you need some new ones? It means the ones you have are wrong. So evolutionists needed something new. Sure enough, a new theory soon came to the rescue. Yep, it's those asteroids again. You see, billions of years ago, a really big asteroid, one the size of Mars, crashed into the Earth. Both the asteroid and the Earth were broken up in this catastrophe. Lots of material was sprayed out into space. Some of it formed into the Moon, and the rest of it came back into the Earth. However, the iron from both bodies sank into the Earth's core, so this explains why the Moon doesn't have much iron today. So how good is this theory? Well, the media will tell you that computer simulations have proven it to be true, but that's nonsense. First of all, computer simulations can never prove anything happened, only that it's one possibility for how something might have happened. Secondly, this model only works with very narrow parameters. You need an asteroid of exactly the right size, coming in at exactly the right speed, and exactly the right angle for this to be even possible. And there's lots of debate about whether or not it works even within these narrow boundaries. Even many evolutionists don't accept this model. For example, one evolutionary astrophysicist has complained, the collision has to be implausibly gentle. You practically need someone to hold a Mars-sized object just above Earth and drop it to avoid messing up Earth's orbit. Not only that, scientists recently took a closer look at some of the soil samples that astronauts brought back from the moon. They discovered that some of the samples contain water. This was a complete shock to evolutionists. The giant impact theory says that the moon can't have any water today. It would have been vaporized and lost during the collision. As one scientist commented, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which a giant impact melts completely the moon and at the same time allows it to hold on to its water. That's a really difficult knot to untie. Thanks to this new discovery, the giant impact hypothesis is in serious trouble, and that was the only idea that was remotely possible for an evolutionary origin of our moon. Sounds like evolution can't explain where the moon came from. The Bible was right all along. This shouldn't have surprised anyone though. All along, there's been a lot of evidence that the moon can't be billions of years old. For example, this is the Aristarchus Plateau. This is one of many locations on the moon that have been controversial for a long time. For centuries, people have seen flashes and temporary glows of light in these locations. These events don't last long, so it's been very difficult to photograph them. But we have written accounts of them going back to the 1500s. It seems that the moon is still geologically active, releasing gas from volcanic vents. This is the Eratosthenes crater, another location where unusual sightings have occurred. Evolutionists have rejected all these sightings as nonsense. In their models, the moon's volcanic activity stopped about 3.2 billion years ago. The moon is old, cold, and dead. It can't be geologically active, or so they've always said. Finally, though, all the accumulating evidence became too much. In 1968, NASA released its chronological catalog of reported lunar events. This report listed 579 separate sightings of anomalous events on the moon. A couple of years later, the Apollo 15 mission even measured radon gas coming from the Aristarchus crater. Apparently, the moon is still geologically active. This makes perfect sense if it was only a few thousand years old. It's not old, cold, and dead after all. The funny thing is, for the most part, evolutionists still won't admit any of this. In 2006, a study was published that said, well, we used to think that all geological activity stopped there 3.2 billion years ago, but now we admit we were wrong. It continued until 10 million years ago. They just have to stick with the millions of years. They just can't admit that the moon is young, and that its geological activity is still going on today. After all, if the moon was young, then the Bible would be right, and they don't want that. There's still one final problem with the evolutionist model that we haven't discussed yet. When our astronauts went to the moon, they brought lots of experiments with them. One of those experiments was called LLR, or Lunar Laser Ranging. These were special mirrors that the astronauts left behind on the moon. These are the locations where the Apollo missions landed. Apollo 11, 14, and 15 were the three missions that left behind the LLR reflectors. The reflectors look like this. Scientists on the Earth can fire a laser at one of these reflectors, and if the laser hits the target directly, which is really hard to do as you can imagine, but they are able to do this, then the laser bounces back to Earth. Scientists then measure how long the light took to return, and then they figure out exactly how far away the moon is from us. This is still being done today, by the way. It's the only Apollo experiment that's still going on. Here's why this is important. Scientists have discovered that the moon is moving further away from us every year. This was already suspected before Apollo, but now we've been able to measure it. So why is this happening? It's because the moon is raising ocean tides on the Earth. This causes our ocean to bulge towards the moon. However, the Earth is spinning underneath the bulge and pulling it forward. The bulge itself then exerts a gravitational pull on the moon, which accelerates it and moves it outward in its orbit. That's a complicated process, but don't worry about the details. The important part is this. The moon is moving away from the Earth at about 3.8 centimeters per year. That's about 1.5 inches each year. We've measured this for years, and we know exactly why it's happening. 1.5 inches per year doesn't sound like much, but the way this works, it would have been receding faster in the past. Looking backwards in time, the moon would have been much closer to the Earth than today. In fact, calculations show that the moon would have been touching the Earth only 1.5 billion years ago. Obviously, this is impossible. Obviously, the moon can't have been orbiting the Earth for 4 billion years, as evolutionists claim. By the way, I should mention that evolutionists have been trying to solve this problem. There are some articles floating around on the internet that say this isn't a problem for evolution anymore. But those articles are wrong. If you're curious why, you can go to www.creationastronomy.com for details. So here's what you're not being told about the moon. Evolution can't explain why it's there. Evolution can't explain why it's still geologically active. And evolution can't explain how it could be receding for billions of years. What the Bible says about the moon is true. The moon is young and designed just for us. Mars is the fourth planet from the Sun. We first landed a spacecraft on it successfully in 1976. Since then, we've sent many other probes and have learned a lot about the red planet. Mars has turned out to be a rocky desert. Even though it's much smaller than the Earth, it has some very dramatic terrain. This is Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system. It's about the same size as the state of Arizona. Mars also has the largest canyon in the entire solar system. This is the Mariner Valley, or Valles Marineris. This enormous rift valley is as long as the continental United States. It's over 9 times as long as the Grand Canyon, about 7 times as wide, and 4 times as deep. It's almost as deep as Mount Everest is high. Mars is probably the planet that's in the news most often. You've probably heard about all this evidence for water on Mars that keeps getting discovered. Some evolutionists even say large parts of Mars used to be flooded with water, maybe even the whole planet. Let's talk about that for a moment. Many formations on Mars look like they were formed by liquid water. There are chasms, gullies, layer deposits, shorelines, and other formations that flowing water can produce. There's also evidence for water geysers and other dramatic events. But Mars is a giant desert today. Sometimes it has dust storms that cover the entire planet. How could there have been flooding on Mars? Mars does actually have water on it today, but not in liquid form. For example, there's water vapor in the atmosphere. More importantly, Mars has a lot of water ice at the poles. Water is also frozen under the surface elsewhere on the planet. This would seem to be the source of at least some of the formations we've seen. For example, a volcano or some other event that heats up the surface sufficiently could melt the ice frozen into the surface and cause flooding. But how long could this liquid water last on the surface? Under current conditions, it can't last long at all. That's why Mars is so dry today. Mars has a very thin atmosphere. This means the boiling point of water is very low. Even though it's very cold on Mars, a puddle of water would evaporate away quickly. Despite all this, evolutionists speculate that Mars used to have huge oceans of liquid water, which lasted for hundreds of millions of years. Why? Because they want to find life on other planets, and they need liquid water to do it. They seem to think that finding life somewhere besides Earth would prove evolution. Well, that's absurd in multiple ways. First of all, water doesn't mean life. You need water for life, but you also need lots of other things, especially an intelligent designer who can create it all. Louis Pasteur already proved that life can't arise from non-living chemicals, and that was over 150 years ago. Evolutionists need to update their scientific approach. Even if we did find life on other planets, that wouldn't prove evolution anyway. Evolution can't explain how life arose at all, anywhere. For example, one evolutionist wrote this: "More than 30 years of experimentation on the origin of life in the fields of chemical and molecular evolution have led to a better perception of the immensity of the problem of the origin of life on Earth, rather than to its solution." At present, all discussion on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance. Another evolutionist admitted this: "It is extremely improbable that proteins and nucleic acids, both of which are structurally complex, and both of which are required for life, by the way, arose spontaneously in the same place at the same time. Yet it also seems impossible to have one without the other. And so, at first glance, one might have to conclude that life could never, in fact, have originated by chemical means." I could give lots of other examples, but we don't have the time. My point is that evolution can't explain how life could have started without a creator. Yet evolutionists are always looking for life somewhere else, as if that would help them solve this problem. But finding life somewhere else would just increase the number of places where evolution can't explain it. Anyway, that's one of the main reasons evolutionists want to find evidence for water on Mars. Unfortunately for them, as I mentioned before, liquid water is impossible on Mars today. But evolutionists want a history of water there really, really badly. This creates a huge problem. And where there's a problem, you need a solution. Evolutionists believe that Mars used to have a thick atmosphere, like they want. But then an asteroid hit the planet and stripped it away. Let's think about this for a moment. Mars is a desert planet where it's physically impossible to have water. But evolutionists desperately want water there. In fact, they want enough water to flood the whole planet. So they invoke this catastrophe for which there's no evidence. On the other hand, the Earth has lots of water, more than enough to drown the entire planet 1.5 miles deep. And the Bible confirms that all the land was underwater at the time of Noah's flood. Plus, there's lots of physical evidence for a global flood on our planet. But evolutionists mock us for accepting the biblical account. They say that believing in a catastrophe is unscientific. Do you see the hypocrisy here? This is a vital point. In this video, you'll see that evolutionists invoke catastrophes over and over again to fill the gaps in their models. And to be fair, it's possible that catastrophes have played a role in shaping the planets and moons in our solar system. After all, the Bible doesn't tell us much about the history of these objects, so we can't be dogmatic about what did or didn't happen to them in the past. Nevertheless, there's usually little evidence for any of the collisions invoked by the evolutionists. In the history of the entire solar system, there's only one catastrophe that we know for sure occurred: a global flood here on Earth. And this one catastrophe, the only one with overwhelming evidence from geology, history, and the Word of God itself, this catastrophe, the evolutionists reject absolutely. That's why in this video I'm emphasizing how often the evolutionists use asteroid collisions to rescue their models from the facts. Again and again, they invoke speculative catastrophes all over the solar system, but then they ridicule creationary scientists for using a well-supported catastrophe to interpret geological formations on Earth. And Mars is a perfect example of this inconsistency. Evolutionists are demanding watery catastrophes on Mars, where there can be no water today. Yet they mock creationists for believing in a watery catastrophe on Earth, which is covered with water today. As I said, this is utter hypocrisy. Mars is also an excellent illustration of the rank speculation that is passed off as science today. For example, perhaps the preeminent scientific journal in the world today is Nature. Nature recently ran an article with this headline: "Wheel of Spirit hints at life on Mars." The Spirit being referred to here is a small rover that we landed on Mars. So if all you saw was this headline, you'd think, wow, Spirit found evidence for life on Mars. But what exactly did Spirit find? Only a little patch of sandy material, which might be silica, which might have formed from a volcanic fumarole. And on Earth, volcanic fumaroles sometimes have bacteria in them. Bingo! We found evidence for life on Mars. Isn't this absurd? A patch of sand somehow becomes hints of life on Mars. If a creationary scientist said something half this silly, he'd be mocked and ridiculed. But evolutionary believers do this sort of thing all the time. They often come up with wild speculations, which are presented as scientific fact. Remember this the next time you hear a news story about evidence for water, or even life, on Mars, or about all the evidence we have for evolution here on Earth. Try to find out what the evidence really is. It's often a lot less persuasive than they say. So here's what you aren't being told about Mars. Evolutionists want a long history of global oceans on Mars, but it's physically impossible for liquid water to exist on Mars today. The evolutionist view of Mars reveals the hypocrisy of their approach. And Mars is a good example of the wild evolutionary speculations that are passed off as science today. Jupiter is sometimes called the king of the planets. It's the largest planet in our solar system. Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune are giants too. They're all much bigger than the Earth, as you can see. But Jupiter is by far the biggest. Jupiter has beautiful, intricate clouds swirling over its entire surface. It also has a famous feature called the Great Red Spot. The red spot is a huge storm system swirling on Jupiter. This has existed for about as long as we've had telescopes to look at it, so it's hundreds of years old at least. It might even have been there since Jupiter was created, for all we know. As you can see, this one storm is bigger than the entire Earth. Jupiter also has huge electrical storms on its surface. Jupiter is a violent place. Just like all the other planets, Jupiter confounds evolutionary models of our solar system. To produce a planet this big, you need a lot of raw materials, and the evolutionary model can't supply them. According to the evolutionary model, Jupiter had to form a bit differently than the Earth. Like the Earth, it supposedly started when some planetesimals, or asteroids, formed from the solar nebula and gathered together. But unlike the Earth, these planetesimals had enough mass, and therefore enough gravity, to collect lots of gas from the solar nebula too. Then, after several million years of gas collecting, Jupiter had formed. Well, that doesn't work, for several reasons. First of all, as we've already seen, the secular model can't make asteroids out of gas and dust. As one paper commented, the process by which submicrometer-sized protoplanetary dust particles evolve to kilometer-sized planetesimals is still enigmatic. Another admitted that the process by which planetesimals could form is unknown. In fact, not only are there problems building large asteroids, the models can't even produce small ones. As a JPL NASA press release explained, the problem with this tidy little theory is that when the burgeoning space rocks grew to about 1 meter in size, orbital mechanics tells us the gas commingling with them in the protoplanetary disk should have acted like a brake, slowing their velocity appreciably. Their orbital speed having been cut, these filing cabinet-sized space rocks would have spiraled into the sun. So even if small planetesimals managed to form, they would have been destroyed fairly quickly. As a paper in Nature pointed out, how this process continues from meter-sized boulders to kilometer-scale planetesimals is a major unsolved problem. Boulders are expected to stick together poorly and to spiral into the protostar in a few hundred orbits, owing to a headwind from the slower rotating gas. So the secular model can't make planetesimals. But without planetesimals, the secular model can't explain any of the planets, including Jupiter. And even if you could make planetesimals from gas and dust, secular scientists have discovered that they still couldn't explain Jupiter, because its chemical composition doesn't match their models. Evolutionary models say that Jupiter should have very little of certain elements: argon, krypton, xenon, and others. But we've discovered that Jupiter has about 3 times as much of these elements as evolutionists had expected. According to secular models, Jupiter can't have these elements in the concentrations that we observe, because those elements can't have been in Jupiter's region of the solar system back when Jupiter was forming. According to the models, the only place that these elements are allowed to have formed is way out beyond the orbit of Neptune, more than 3 billion miles from where Jupiter is today. To try and solve this problem, some evolutionists have suggested that Jupiter must have formed way out there, and then moved inward. But this doesn't make sense for several reasons. Among other things, the secular model says there wouldn't have been enough material out there for Jupiter to assemble from. Others have suggested that the unexpected elements came from planetesimals, or asteroids, that formed way out there and then moved billions of miles inward, delivering these elements to Jupiter. But that doesn't work either. If they had formed out there and then moved in, they would have warmed up as they moved toward the sun, and as they got warmer, they would have lost whatever argon, krypton, and xenon they contained. As some secular researchers commented, it remains to be shown how planetesimals that formed at the very low temperatures required to explain the observations could have found their way to Jupiter. The secular model can't account for Jupiter. The planet as we see it today just shouldn't be there, but there it is. An article in the scientific journal Nature discussed this problem. An overview of that article said, "Jupiter is the largest of all the planets." But results in Nature now reveal the embarrassing fact that we know next to nothing about how, or where, it formed. Overall, according to the secular model, it seems that Jupiter shouldn't exist. But of course it does. As one report said, "Talk about a major embarrassment for planetary scientists. There, blazing away in the late evening sky, are Jupiter and Saturn, the gas giants that account for 93% of the solar system's planetary mass, and no one has a satisfying explanation of how they were made." Well, that last part isn't true. The Bible has a very satisfying explanation of how they were made. But now that evolutionists have rejected the Bible, their only explanation for these planets is lots of shoulder shrugging. Jupiter has over 60 moons. They pose problems for evolution too. Let's take a look at the 4 biggest ones. From upper left clockwise, we have Io, Europa, Callisto, and Ganymede. Ganymede is the largest of Jupiter's moons. It's even bigger than the planet Mercury. Ganymede has one of the most bizarre surfaces in our entire solar system. It's crisscrossed with ridges and grooved terrain, but with weird patterns streaking across it all. Some places are rough and rocky, other places are flat and smooth. It almost looks like somebody took a giant paintbrush and painted huge swipes across the surface. But this isn't the only challenge Ganymede poses for people who try to explain how it formed without a creator. Evolutionary models predicted that Ganymede couldn't have a magnetic field. But when our space probes arrived and started taking measurements, we found that it does have a magnetic field. Ganymede doesn't match the evolutionary model at all. Then there's Callisto. This moon is the most heavily cratered object in the solar system. Evolutionists believe that it has one of the oldest surfaces of any object, about 4 billion years old. It was a real surprise then when our space probes took some close-up pictures. Evolutionists expected a large number of smaller craters to go with the big ones. But they aren't there. They should be there if the surface is really billions of years old, but they're not. Callisto doesn't match the evolutionary cratering model. Not only that, some of the pictures show what appears to be fresh ice on Callisto's surface. This means that there's still erosion and geological activity going on. Evolutionary models say that Callisto is old, cold, and dead, but apparently that's not true. Next, there's Europa. Europa is in some ways the opposite of Callisto. Callisto is the most heavily cratered object in the solar system. Europa is the smoothest. Not only are there very few craters, Europa has very little terrain of any kind. It's almost perfectly smooth. The entire moon is covered with a shell of ice. The ice is several miles thick, but some scientists believe there might be liquid water beneath it. And where there's water, there has to be life, right? We already talked about how ridiculous that idea is, but nevertheless, you still hear it in the news a lot. Somebody finds a new crack on Europa and thinks, ooh, look, water might ooze up into the crack, and there might be life evolving in the water. Then some reporter runs a story about it that says we're on the verge of finding life elsewhere in the solar system, even though all we found was a crack in a moon. That sounds ridiculous, but it happens a lot in astronomy, unfortunately. Because Europa has only a few craters, we've been able to study them closely. One recent study has shown that the evolutionary model for cratering is all wrong. We've talked about cratering before. We've seen that evolutionists like to use craters to date things in the solar system. After all, the more craters something has, the longer it's been sitting there getting struck by other objects. Well, this study discovered that the impact of just one object can throw up debris and form lots and lots of craters. Scientists had already known this was possible, but evolutionists didn't expect the effect to be this large. The study showed that up to 95% of small craters and a lot of the medium ones were formed in this way. This means that these planets and moons have been struck with a lot fewer impacts than evolutionists thought. And that calls into question all those billions of years that these objects have supposedly been around. Remember that Venus's surface looks very young, but its crater supposedly proved is a 500 million years old? Now we know this isn't true. And craters are also used to support an old age for the Earth's moon. Supposedly, our moon needed billions of years to accumulate all of its craters. Thanks to Europa, we now know this isn't true. The scientists in this study specifically said the Europa results caused problems for the current accepted age of Earth's moon. Isn't it interesting that one small moon of Jupiter, so far away from us, can wreck evolutionary models of even our own moon? The last moon of Jupiter that we'll be discussing is Io. Compared to Jupiter, Io is an insignificant little speck of a moon. But it's turned out to be one of the most spectacular places in the solar system. Io's surface is covered with volcanoes. All the spots you see on its surface here are volcanic. Over 400 volcanoes have been counted on Io, and at least 150 of them are active today. The black spot you see here is a volcano named Loki. It's more powerful than all the Earth's volcanoes combined. Volcanoes in Io can be incredibly violent. We've seen fountains of lava blasting material 180 miles into space. We've also measured geysers of lava shooting out of the volcanoes at over 2,000 miles per hour. That's more than 10 times as fast as the most violent volcanoes here on Earth. Io gives us some fascinating insights on the long-age evolutionary theories. For example, Io puts out twice as much heat as the Earth does. Where does all this heat come from? Well, some of it comes from tidal flexing. Io is caught in a gravitational tug-of-war between Jupiter on the one side and Jupiter's other large moons on the other. They're both pulling on Io, and this squeezing and flexing is generating heat inside Io's interior. The problem is that this squeezing can only account for some of Io's heat. So where does the rest of the heat come from? Well, if Io is young, it could still be cooling off from its initial formation. But if it's really billions of years old, that energy would have dissipated long ago. So, according to evolutionary theory, Io shouldn't have all those active volcanoes you see on its surface, but it does. Io's volcanoes create another problem for the models with billions of years. We've measured the lavas coming from the volcanoes, and there's an amazing amount of it. The Amirani volcano alone, which you see here, is flooding the moon's surface with 100 cubic meters of lava per second. It's erupting like that continuously, and this isn't even the biggest volcano on Io. For example, look at these before and after pictures of the Pilon Patera. Between the times these photos were taken, there was a massive eruption that produced the dark spot you see on the upper right. That's a huge lava flow, about as big as the state of Nevada. And these flows happen quickly. We saw a different volcano produce almost this much lava in just 2 days. Has Io really been erupting like this for 4.5 billion years? We've measured some of these flows coming out of these volcanoes, and it's a huge amount of material. If Io really was 4.5 billion years old, it would have recycled itself through its own volcanoes over 30 times. Surely Io can't be billions of years old. And there's another problem too. We've studied volcanoes on Earth, and the lavas here reach amazing temperatures, 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At least these temperatures seemed amazing until we examined Io. Evolutionists were flabbergasted with the discovery that some of the lavas on Io are almost 1,000 degrees hotter than Earth lavas. They're also very dense. So here's the problem for evolution. If Io really was billions of years old, these temperatures and densities wouldn't be possible. After the first few million years, Io should have formed a low-density crust after all the higher-density material sank down to the inside. But there are still high-density materials on the surface. Forget about billions of years. Io apparently isn't even millions of years old. Io looks quite young. It matches perfectly with the biblical account of creation just a few thousand years ago. And that brings us to the end of our discussion on Jupiter. So let's review. Here's what you're not being told about Jupiter and its moons. According to the secular model, Jupiter can't be made up of the materials it's made up of. In fact, the model can't account for any of the planetesimals that Jupiter was supposedly built from. Therefore, it can't account for the planet itself. Ganymede shouldn't have a magnetic field, but it does. Callisto shouldn't be geologically active, but it is. Europa shows that long-age crater counting methods are wrong, and Io looks very young. Evolutionary models fail utterly to explain Jupiter. That's why evolutionists make complaints like this one. Building Jupiter has long been a problem for theorists. Or this one. I don't think the existence of Jupiter would be predicted if it weren't observed. So why do they still cling to a broken model? Because when you reject the truth, you have to accept a lie. Pity the poor evolutionist who is so committed to a bankrupt theory that he can't see the hand of his creator in this majestic planet. Saturn's rings are one of the most famous sights in all of astronomy. The rings look solid, but they're not. They're actually made up of millions of particles, all orbiting Saturn together. The particles are mostly ice and dirt. Some are as small as grains of dust, others are large boulders. The rings are also razor thin compared to Saturn's bulk. This series of pictures was taken as the Cassini spacecraft moved from below the rings to above them. You can see how thin the rings are. When you compare their width to their thickness, it's about the same as a sheet of paper that's as wide as the city of San Francisco. Oh, and that little guy you saw shooting across the top was one of Saturn's moons. We'll talk about a couple of those in just a few minutes. Saturn's rings are mysterious. They're more than just belts of particles orbiting the planet. For example, there are spokes in them, as you see here. Some of them are even braided. Nobody expected these features in the rings, and some of them are still a puzzle. It's as if somebody created them just to delight and fascinate us. So how did the rings get there? I believe they were created at the same time Saturn was, a few thousand years ago. Of course, evolutionists won't accept this. Here's what a NASA scientist had to say about them. After all this time, we're still not sure about the origin of Saturn's rings, says Jeff Kusi, a planetary scientist at the NASA Ames Research Center. Kusi speculates that some hundreds of millions of years ago, a time when the earliest dinosaurs roamed our planet, Saturn had no bright rings. Then, he says, something unlikely happened. Yes, that's right. Here's Jeff Kusi again. A moon-sized object from the outer solar system might have flown nearby Saturn where tidal forces ripped it apart. Or maybe an asteroid smashed one of Saturn's existing moons. The debris encircled the planet and formed the rings we see today. Are you starting to detect a pattern in evolutionist explanations? Not all evolutionists take refuge in this, though. There's a report from NASA on Saturn's rings that I think is interesting. Here's what it says. Saturn's rings, age and origin unknown. Saturn defies evolutionary models in several ways. For one thing, its magnetic field doesn't match evolutionary predictions at all. As one article explained, Saturn dumbfounded planetary theorists who study dynamo models by having a highly symmetric internal magnetic field. A field that is symmetric about the rotation axis violates a basic theorem of magnetic dynamos. Saturn's magnetic field doesn't seem to be coming from a dynamo. This would be impossible if Saturn were billions of years old, as evolution says. But there's no problem at all if Saturn is only thousands of years old, as the Bible says. But there's an even bigger problem we need to discuss. A recent study took a closer look at the formation of Saturn and Jupiter. Remember that model of the gas and dust cloud that supposedly formed all the planets? Well, the study discovered that Saturn, and Jupiter as well, wouldn't be here today if that model was true. One report on the study described this model and then said this: these theories fail to describe the formation of gas giant planets in a satisfactory way. Gravitational interaction between the gaseous protoplanetary disk and the massive planetary cores causes them to move rapidly inward over about 100,000 years in what we call the migration of the planet and the disk. Theories predict that the giant protoplanets will merge into the central star before planets have time to form. This makes it very difficult to understand how they can form at all. Astronomers call this the migration problem.